The town of Elbridge had always been the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened. Its people lived quiet lives nestled between distant hills and endless highways. But all that changed on a warm Thursday morning. Daryl Maddox, a former Marine-turned-mechanic, stood in front of his garage wiping oil from his hands when the first sirens broke the morning calm. The sound wasn't unusual in cities, but in Elbridge, where even a fire truck rolling down Main Street caused gossip, it was unsettling. Moments later, a military convoy thundered past. That had never happened before. From his porch, Old Man Rigsby muttered something to himself. Daryl barely noticed. His focus shifted to the sky as two helicopters darted overhead, heading toward the northern sector. That's when his phone buzzed. "Daryl, get to the shelter." "They're evacuating parts of the state," his sister Lorna said, her voice shaky. "Something's happening. People are going crazy. Attacking each other. They're saying it's some kind of sickness. Or rage, I don't know." "Where are you now?" he asked, suddenly alert. "At the school. I locked the doors, but some kids, Daryl, something bit one of them." She started screaming. Then she changed. Daryl's stomach turned. Lorna had been a nurse before becoming a teacher. She was not the panicking type. "I'm coming," he said and rushed inside for his go-bag, a habit left over from years in the field. A pistol, extra magazines, water, protein bars, and a radio. He threw it all into the battered duffel and started the engine of his pickup. As he drove, he tuned into the emergency broadcast system. A flat, robotic voice repeated the same message: "This is not a drill. Residents in zones 6 through 13 must evacuate. Do not engage with infected individuals. Seek shelter. Trust only verified military or emergency personnel." The road to the school was clogged. People abandoning vehicles. Some shouting. A few running. As Daryl slowed near a gas station, he noticed a woman lying face down by the pumps. Another person, pale and jerking unnaturally, crouched beside her. He shouted from the truck. "Hey! Are you okay?" The figure turned its head sharply. Its eyes were pale, its mouth smeared with something dark. It didn't speak. It ran. Daryl floored the gas. When he reached the school, the main gate had been torn open. Windows were broken. Smoke drifted from the cafeteria side. He grabbed the pistol from the glove box and ran inside. "Lorna," he called. Gunshots echoed in the distance, maybe from the downtown area. Inside the hallway, the light flickered. Papers scattered. A trail of blood led around the corner. Daryl pressed his back to the wall and crept forward. A door slammed. A voice cried out, "Get back." I said stay back. It was Lorna. He burst into the classroom and saw her. She stood on a desk, wielding a chair like a weapon. Two students, or what used to be students, clawed at the air below her. Their eyes were lifeless, but their movement was fast, jerky, animal-like. Daryl didn't hesitate. 2 shots. The creatures fell. Lorna jumped down and hugged him hard. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. "What happened?" "One of the kids was bitten on a field trip. Nobody thought it was serious. Then she attacked the nurse. And it just spread." "How many are left?" 4 students. I locked them in the music room. They're still okay. For now." Daryl nodded. "We're leaving. This place won't hold much longer." They retrieved the kids, scared, tearful, and made their way to the truck. As they exited, more of the infected appeared, stumbling from buildings, their senses drawn to sound and movement. Daryl fired a few warning shots and sped off, taking the back road toward the outskirts. Behind them, Elbridge was falling apart. They drove in silence until they reached a secluded cabin Daryl used during hunting season. He parked the truck and looked at Lorna. "This isn't over," he said. "Whatever this is, it's spreading fast." Lorna stared back. "You think the military will stop it?" Daryl shook his head slowly. I think we just entered a war. And this time, peace won't save us. And somewhere beyond the hills, in a government facility no longer under control, the real cause of the outbreak stirred, evolving, adapting, waiting for its moment to spread far beyond the borders of one small town. Part 2 will dive into the growing threat, an early survivor community, and a betrayal that puts everyone at risk. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? You said. The cabin was small, rustic, and isolated. Just the kind of place you hope to be in the middle of a crisis. Daryl, Lorna, and the 4 kids huddled around the fire, each lost in their thoughts. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the growing sense of dread that seemed to settle over the world. Where do we go now? Lorna asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Daryl stared into the flames, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his seat. He had always been good under pressure, but this was something else. The infected were no longer just rumors or the stuff of movies. They were real, and they were everywhere. We head south, he said, breaking his silence. We'll try to find other survivors. Somewhere that's still safe. Maybe even a military base. But we don't know who we can trust, Lorna argued. What if it's already too late? Daryl met her gaze. If we don't try, we'll be dead before the week is out. Lorna nodded slowly. It was hard to argue with that. The kids, still shaken, sat near the fire, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering light. The youngest, a boy named Aaron, clutched his stuffed rabbit tightly, his knuckles white. His sister, Mia, kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. How long until we can leave? Mia asked, her voice small. Soon, Daryl said. Get some sleep while you can. We'll head out first light. The night dragged on. Daryl kept watch, his mind racing through every possibility. He knew the longer they stayed in one place, the higher the risk. But even more pressing was the question of whether or not the world had truly ended. Was there still a chance for humanity, or were they just delaying the inevitable? By dawn, the fire had burned out, and the cabin felt colder. Daryl shook off the tiredness from his bones and stood. The first light of morning barely broke through the thick forest, but it was enough to give them a sense of direction. We leave now, Daryl said, gathering the kids. Stay close, and don't make any noise. The journey south was difficult. The roads were mostly empty, save for abandoned cars and the occasional body. The air felt thick with uncertainty, and every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made everyone jump. They stopped at an old gas station just outside of town. Daryl approached cautiously, scanning the area. It was too quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I don't like this, Lorna muttered, clutching her rifle. Something's not right. We need gas, Daryl replied. We can't risk running out. They made their way to the pumps, but just as Daryl reached the station's door, he heard a low growl. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his side. But it wasn't one of the infected. It was a dog, dirty and ragged, but alive. Stay back, Daryl warned, but the dog didn't seem interested in them. It was sniffing around the ground, near a pile of shredded bags. It growled again, its fur bristling. Is it? Lorna started, but Daryl shook his head. It's not one of them, he said. I think it's just hungry. Before they could move forward, another growl came from behind them. Then another. Daryl turned, scanning the surrounding area. His heart dropped when he saw the pack. 5 more dogs emerged from the shadows, their eyes wild, their teeth bared. They were lean, feral, and desperate. As they circled, Daryl's mind raced. These weren't just ordinary strays. Something was making them aggressive. Back inside, he shouted, pulling Lorna and the kids toward the shelter of the building. The dogs attacked in a frenzy, their claws scraping against the pavement. Daryl opened fire, but the shots were wild, hitting nothing but air. The dogs were too fast, too erratic. Get in the truck! Daryl yelled. Go, now! He fired again, striking one of the dogs in the shoulder. It yelped and staggered back, but the others didn't stop. Lorna pushed the kids into the truck as Daryl took a few more steps back. The dogs weren't giving up. They were closing in. With his back to the truck, Daryl threw one last glance over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Lorna, go!" Lorna hesitated, but then slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and the truck sped off, leaving Daryl behind. The dogs were almost upon him when the last shot rang out, a clean, precise hit that took down the closest dog. Daryl exhaled sharply, his body shaking with adrenaline. His heart was pounding. He had no choice but to make it back to the truck, and quickly. He ran, dodging one last lunging dog. Just as his foot hit the ground, he dove into the open truck bed. "Go!" he shouted. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching as it sped down the road. The dogs retreated into the woods, their eyes glinting with hunger. For a moment, Daryl didn't speak. His heart was still racing, but he knew one thing for sure. Surviving wasn't going to be easy. And it wasn't just the infected they had to worry about. "Would you like me to continue with part 3? The truck rumbled along the desolate highway, the once busy road now eerily empty. The hum of the tires on cracked asphalt was the only sound that filled the air. Daryl gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as his eyes flickered between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. Lorna sat in the passenger seat, her face pale and tense. She had been quiet ever since the incident with the dogs, her mind no doubt replaying the close call. But Daryl knew her well enough to understand that she was processing, holding herself together, waiting for the right moment to speak. The 4 kids in the back remained silent, their eyes wide and glued to the small window, watching the landscape blur past. The weight of the world was pressing down on them all. "How much farther?" Lorna asked, breaking the silence. Daryl shifted in his seat. "We're getting close. There's a small town about an hour away. It's a risk, but it might be worth checking out. We need to refuel and resupply." "You think it'll be safe?" she asked skeptically. "There's no such thing as safe anymore," he replied, his voice flat. "But we'll take our chances." The landscape around them began to shift, from dense forest to open fields and abandoned buildings. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the decaying remains of civilization. Daryl couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. He had always loved this country, its open roads, its promise of a future. Now it all felt like a distant memory. As they neared the small town, Daryl's nerves kicked into overdrive. The world felt too quiet, the calm before the storm. He slowed the truck, carefully watching the empty streets. The houses were in disrepair, windows boarded up, doors hanging off their hinges. There was no sign of life. "We need to check the gas station and the general store," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We'll be quick." Lorna looked uneasy. "What if it's a trap?" Daryl glanced at her. "We're not going to find anything sitting around wondering. We'll move fast and keep our eyes open." The truck rolled to a stop in front of the gas station. The small building was covered in graffiti, the glass doors cracked and warped. Daryl killed the engine and slowly stepped out, pistol drawn. "Stay inside the truck," he instructed Lorna, glancing at the kids. "I'll be back in 2 minutes." Lorna hesitated but nodded, her fingers tapping nervously against the door. Daryl approached the gas station cautiously, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The door creaked as he pushed it open, his eyes scanning the dark interior. He saw nothing but dust and abandoned merchandise, shelves overturned and empty. He moved quickly, checking behind counters and under shelves, but there was no sign of the infected. Only the remains of a forgotten world. He grabbed a few cans of food and bottles of water before heading back outside. His breath hitched when he saw movement near the corner of the station. A figure staggered into view. A woman. She was dressed in ragged clothes, her face gaunt, her eyes wild. "Stay back," Daryl shouted, raising his pistol. The woman froze, her hand trembling as she reached toward him. She spoke in a low, broken voice, "Please. I need help." Daryl's finger twitched on the trigger, but something about her voice gave him pause. He studied her carefully. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but not entirely inhuman. She didn't look infected, but she was close, starved, dehydrated, and clearly struggling. "Who are you?" Daryl asked, lowering his weapon slightly. The woman took a hesitant step forward. "My name's Sarah. I'm just trying to survive." "Where are the others?" Daryl asked, his eyes scanning the area around her. "They're gone." "Everyone's gone," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "My group, they were attacked by some things. We thought we could make it to the shelter. But we were wrong." Daryl's mind raced. The infected were bad enough, but groups of survivors who turned on each other or made reckless decisions were just as dangerous. He couldn't risk taking anyone on without knowing their story. "We've seen what's happening out here," Daryl said, his voice hardening. "We're trying to stay alive. If you're a threat." "I'm not," Sarah interrupted, raising her hands in surrender. "I swear. I just want to make it through this." Daryl kept his pistol trained on her for a moment longer, but something about her plea tugged at his conscience. She wasn't one of them, at least not yet. She was just another person caught in this nightmare, like him. "Get in the truck," he said, finally lowering his weapon. "You've got 5 minutes." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The walk back to the truck felt like it took forever. Every sense in Daryl's body was on high alert. He knew the situation could turn in an instant. But as they all piled into the truck, he caught Lorna's suspicious glance in the rearview mirror. "I don't trust her," Lorna said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "She's hiding something." Daryl frowned, but he said nothing. Trust was a luxury that no one could afford anymore. And as much as he wanted to believe Sarah, he knew better than to take anything at face value in a world like this. They drove off, the town disappearing behind them, the unknown ahead. Sarah sat quietly in the back, the 4 kids still staring out the window, lost in their own fears. But in the silence, Daryl's mind wouldn't let go of one thought. In a world where survival was the only rule, could anyone really be trusted? "Would you like me to continue with part 4? The truck cruised along the desolate road, the sun now setting behind them. The sky had turned an ominous shade of orange, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty landscape. The silence inside the truck was suffocating, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone. Daryl's eyes flickered between the road and the rearview mirror, keeping a watchful eye on Sarah, who sat quietly in the back with the kids. Lorna sat beside him, her eyes narrowed in suspicion, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. She'd been on edge ever since Daryl had allowed Sarah to join them, and he knew that trust was a rare commodity these days. But he couldn't help feeling like they needed all the help they could get. Sarah had been silent for the most part, her eyes distant and her posture tense. Daryl had offered her water, but she refused, insisting that she wasn't thirsty. He didn't believe it, but he knew better than to push. In this world, people's minds were just as fragile as their bodies. "I don't like this," Lorna murmured, breaking the stillness. Daryl glanced over at her, catching the concern in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "The quiet," she replied, her voice low. "It's too quiet. Like it's waiting for something." Daryl nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's like the calm before the storm. We're getting closer to something, I can feel it." Lorna turned to face him, her expression serious. "You think the worst is coming?" "I don't know," Daryl said, his voice grim. "But I've been through enough to know that nothing's ever as safe as it seems." They drove on in silence for a while longer, the tension between them thick. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed seemed to make the world feel smaller and more dangerous. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daryl finally pulled off the main road and onto a smaller, overgrown path. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels on either side. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "We need to rest and regroup." Lorna didn't argue. She knew they needed sleep, even if it was only a few hours. The kids were exhausted, their faces pale from the long journey and the terror of the past few days. They were just kids, Daryl thought, and yet they had seen more horror than anyone should in a lifetime. The truck came to a stop in a small clearing, just off the road. Daryl turned off the engine and looked around. It was isolated, and there were no signs of the infected. It felt strangely peaceful, almost too peaceful. "We'll take turns on watch," Daryl said, glancing at Lorna. "You sleep first. I'll take the next shift." Lorna didn't argue, but Daryl saw the way her eyes lingered on Sarah. The tension in the air had only grown since their new companion had joined them. Daryl wasn't blind to it. He had noticed Lorna's distrust from the moment Sarah stepped into the truck. But as much as he wanted to reassure her, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him Sarah was hiding something. "We're not making a mistake, are we?" Lorna asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. Daryl didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the windshield. "I don't know. I hope not." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Lorna sighed and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. "I'll take the first watch," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You get some rest. We'll need it for tomorrow." Daryl nodded and climbed into the back, where the kids were already curled up under blankets. Sarah was sitting with them, her eyes distant and tired. "Is everything okay?" Daryl asked as he lay down on the cold seat, his eyes scanning Sarah's face. Sarah's gaze flickered toward him. "I'm fine. Just tired." He didn't push. There was something about Sarah's demeanor that unsettled him. Her calm was too perfect, too calculated. He wasn't sure if she was hiding something, or if she was simply too broken to show emotion. Either way, he didn't trust her. The minutes stretched into hours, and Daryl finally drifted into a fitful sleep. The world outside was quiet, but Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for them to slip up. When he woke up, the sky was still dark, but the faintest hint of dawn was creeping along the horizon. He sat up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. The kids were still asleep, their faces peaceful for the moment. Lorna was nowhere to be seen. He climbed out of the truck, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his weapon. The cool morning air hit him like a slap, and he scanned the area. Everything seemed calm, but the stillness only made him more uneasy. Lorna was standing a few yards away, her eyes scanning the trees. She didn't say anything as Daryl approached, but he could see the tension in her posture. She was on high alert, and he could feel it too. "What's wrong?" he asked. Lorna's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I heard something. Not sure what, but it's out there." Daryl's eyes narrowed. "Where?" "Over there," she nodded toward the woods. "I think it's just animals, but..." "Yeah, I don't like this either," Daryl replied, his voice tight. "We need to move." But as they prepared to leave, the distant sound of an engine broke the silence. A vehicle was approaching, and Daryl's heart sank. It was too late to escape now. "Would you like me to continue with part 5? The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, and Daryl's senses were on high alert. He motioned for Lorna to stay down, his voice barely a whisper, "Get back in the truck. Now." Lorna didn't hesitate. Her eyes were wide, her mind racing, but she understood the gravity of the situation. She ducked into the truck, closing the door as quietly as possible, while Daryl remained outside, his hand tightening around the grip of his pistol. The engine noise grew closer, now unmistakably the sound of a vehicle coming up the road, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Daryl's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, watching the trees that lined the path. It was too early for anyone to be out here, too quiet. The world had changed, and the sound of an engine meant people. And people, these days, were unpredictable. He crouched behind the truck, staying out of sight, straining to make out the shape of the approaching vehicle. The truck was older, a rusty piece of machinery, but it was still running. That alone was concerning. What kind of people could keep something like that going in a world like this? Lorna's voice came through the crack of the truck window, barely audible. What do we do? Daryl's eyes didn't leave the road. He could hear the wheels crunching against gravel now. The vehicle was almost here. Stay in the truck. Keep the kids down. Don't make a sound. Lorna didn't argue. The tension was suffocating, and even the faintest sound could give them away. The truck slowed as it neared their position, the engine sputtering slightly before it came to a full stop. Daryl held his breath, his eyes fixed on the road as he waited for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. For a long moment, the world stood still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint chirping of birds in the distance. Daryl's heart thudded in his ears as he remained crouched, trying to make sense of the silence. Then, the door of the vehicle creaked open. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tattered military jacket. His face was covered with a dusty bandana, but Daryl could still see the glint of dark eyes scanning the area. He wasn't alone. Two other figures emerged from the vehicle, their movements cautious but purposeful. They looked like they were scanning the surroundings as well, perhaps as wary as Daryl felt. It was clear that they were searching for something, or someone. Daryl's grip on his pistol tightened, his finger ready to pull the trigger if necessary. His mind raced. He could try to ambush them, take them out before they noticed him, but there were too many variables. He had the element of surprise on his side, but he also had 4 kids to protect. Any wrong move could end badly. "We're not alone," Lorna's voice whispered from inside the truck, her words sending a chill down Daryl's spine. He glanced at her, his eyes locking with hers through the truck window. She was right. Whoever these people were, they had no idea they were being watched. The man in the military jacket walked to the front of the vehicle and paused, his head tilted as if listening to something in the distance. Daryl didn't move, his eyes never leaving the stranger. Every instinct told him to wait. The group stood motionless for a moment, exchanging quiet words. The man with the bandana then nodded to the others and began to walk toward the woods, his boots crunching the leaves beneath his feet. The 2 other figures followed, staying close to one another, moving with a practiced silence. Daryl stayed crouched, watching them disappear into the trees. It wasn't until they were out of sight that he allowed himself to breathe. Lorna's voice was tense as she called out softly, "What do we do now?" Daryl stood up slowly, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here. Fast. I don't trust them." "Why? What did they do?" Lorna asked, confused. Daryl looked over his shoulder, keeping his eyes on the woods. "Those guys, they're hunting something. And I'm pretty sure it's not just food." He paused, thinking back to the way they moved, the way they were scanning the area. They had been too careful, too deliberate. It was almost like they were searching for survivors, or worse, the infected. Whatever it was, Daryl didn't want to stick around to find out. Lorna's eyes narrowed. "You think they're a threat?" "I don't know," Daryl replied, his voice grim. "But I've seen enough to know that no one out here can be trusted. We need to keep moving." He climbed back into the truck, his mind already running through options. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger that had just passed them by. But the window of opportunity was closing fast. Daryl started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the air. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, but it was the only option they had. He couldn't afford to wait around any longer. As the truck rolled forward, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the land. The trees and ruins blurred past as Daryl focused on the road ahead, but his thoughts were with the men he'd just seen. The world was full of danger, but there was something about those men that felt different. And Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again, whether he wanted it or not. Would you like to continue with part 6? The sun hung low in the sky as Daryl maneuvered the truck through the winding, abandoned roads. The earlier encounter with the strange group still weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That unsettling sense of paranoia had been a constant companion since the outbreak, but today it was sharper, more intense. Lorna sat beside him, her eyes scanning the trees as if expecting the group to appear from the shadows at any moment. She hadn't said much since their escape, but Daryl could feel the tension in her, as if she too was waiting for something to go wrong. Behind them, the kids were still asleep, their faces pale and fragile in the back seat. They had no idea what kind of danger lurked just outside their door, and Daryl intended to keep it that way. They had seen enough horror in the last few days to last a lifetime. "I'm not liking this one bit," Lorna finally spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, her eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. Daryl didn't look at her. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "I know. But we can't keep driving in circles. We need a place to rest. We can't trust anyone out here," Lorna insisted. "Those men, they were too quiet, too careful. They're looking for something, and it's not just supplies." Daryl nodded, his gaze hardening. "I know. That's why we need to move quickly. If they're after us, we won't last long if we stop." They drove on for what seemed like hours, the truck's engine humming steadily, its tires kicking up dust along the empty road. Every now and then, Daryl would glance at the trees, his sharp eyes scanning for movement. But there was nothing. No sign of life. Finally, as the last remnants of daylight began to fade, Daryl spotted a small, abandoned gas station off the side of the road. The building was run down, its windows boarded up, but it looked like it hadn't been disturbed in a while. A safe place to stop, at least for the night. He pulled the truck into the station lot, the engine sputtering to a stop. He immediately cut the ignition, his senses on high alert. The area was eerily quiet, and Daryl couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Still, it was as good as any place to rest. Lorna climbed out of the truck, her hand on the hilt of the knife she kept at her side. Daryl grabbed his rifle from the back seat and motioned for her to follow him. "Stay sharp," he murmured as they walked toward the gas station's entrance. The air felt cold as they approached the building, the sounds of crickets and distant winds the only noise breaking the silence. The glass door had been shattered long ago, leaving only the jagged remnants of what had once been a simple entryway. The place had been stripped clean of any valuables, but there was a faint scent in the air that Daryl couldn't place. "Clear?" Lorna asked, her voice low. Daryl nodded, scanning the interior. It looked empty, the shelves bare and the floor littered with debris. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. Just the eerie emptiness of a world that had fallen apart. "Let's check the back," Daryl said, motioning to the rear of the building. They made their way to the back door, cautiously avoiding any broken glass or debris that might give away their position. The building had once been a place of refuge for travelers, but now it was just another reminder of what the world had become. A place of desperation, of survival. The back door creaked as Daryl pushed it open, revealing a small storage area filled with old crates and discarded supplies. It didn't look like anyone had been here for weeks, but the smell of rotting food was unmistakable. Lorna gagged but quickly recovered, her eyes scanning the shelves. "Nothing here either." Daryl was about to suggest they move on when the faintest noise caught his attention. It was a rustling sound, coming from the far corner of the room. He froze, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. He signaled to Lorna to stay quiet and motioned toward the corner. His heart was pounding in his chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. They crept toward the noise, each step measured and deliberate. Daryl's breath was steady, but his pulse was racing. He reached the corner first, his rifle aimed in front of him. He was ready to pull the trigger if necessary. But what he saw made him hesitate. There, huddled in the corner, was a woman. Her clothes were ragged, and her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like she hadn't seen another human being in weeks. Daryl didn't lower his weapon, but his voice softened. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes flickered between Daryl and Lorna. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze darting around as though she was trying to decide whether they were a threat. Then, slowly, she spoke in a hoarse whisper, "I didn't know if anyone was left. I didn't think anyone would come." Her voice was shaky, and Daryl could see the terror in her eyes. This was a survivor, just like them, but she was broken. Whatever she had gone through had pushed her to the edge. "We're not here to hurt you," Daryl said, his voice calm but firm. "We're just trying to survive, same as you." The woman didn't seem convinced, but she slowly stood, her hands raised in surrender. "Please. I just need help. I don't know where else to go." Lorna glanced at Daryl, her expression unreadable. They both knew that helping someone could be a gamble. People were unpredictable now. But Daryl couldn't ignore the desperation in her voice. "We'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to trust us." The woman nodded, her face etched with relief and exhaustion. "Thank you." As they made their way back to the truck, Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But for now, there was no turning back. The real war for survival had only just begun. Would you like to continue with Part 7? The road stretched out before them as Daryl kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, the truck rumbling down the darkened highway. The night had settled in quickly, the only light coming from the pale moon above and the dim headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the truck, the air was thick with tension. Lorna sat beside him, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the rearview mirror as though expecting trouble to follow them at any moment. The woman they had found at the gas station, whose name was Emma, was sitting in the back with the kids. She had barely spoken since Daryl and Lorna had agreed to take her with them. Her eyes were distant, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of the world around her. Daryl couldn't blame her. Everyone they encountered these days seemed to be either struggling to survive or barely holding on to their sanity. Emma had shared little about her past, only that she had been alone for weeks after her group had been overrun by the infected. She had been scavenging for food, moving from one abandoned place to another, trying to survive in a world that had gone mad. When Daryl and Lorna had found her, she had been on the verge of collapse, physically and mentally. Now, as the miles passed, Daryl couldn't help but wonder whether they had made a mistake. Trusting another survivor was always a gamble. People could be desperate, dangerous, or worse, broken to the point of betrayal. But in this world, they couldn't afford to turn their backs on anyone. Not yet. "I'm not so sure about this," Lorna finally spoke, her voice quiet but filled with unease. Daryl didn't take his eyes off the road but responded in a low tone, "I know. But we can't just leave her out there." Lorna was silent for a moment before speaking again. "What if she leads us into a trap? What if she's one of them?" Daryl glanced at her. "I'm not sure, but I don't think so. She seemed too desperate. Too vulnerable. We can keep an eye on her. Just don't let your guard down." Lorna nodded, but her expression was still tight with concern. "I don't like it. You saw the way she looked at us. Like she was trying to figure us out." Daryl could feel the weight of her words. He had seen it too, the suspicion in Emma's eyes, the way she kept her distance, almost like she was waiting for something. But Daryl had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his gut told him that they had made the right decision. At least for now. The truck rumbled on, the landscape outside growing darker and more desolate with every passing mile. The world they had known was long gone. What remained was a shattered, dangerous place, where the dead roamed the earth, and the living could be just as deadly. The road they were on led to a small town a few miles away, a potential safe haven, or at least a place to rest and regroup. Daryl wasn't expecting much. The world was full of abandoned places, all of them stripped of anything useful. But there was always a chance they could find something. Anything. As they neared the town, Daryl's instincts told him to slow down. The truck's engine, once a constant hum, seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. The town ahead was dark, its streets eerily quiet, the only sign of life the occasional rustling of the wind and the distant howl of what could have been a dog, or something worse. "Stay sharp," Daryl muttered, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Lorna nodded, her eyes scanning the buildings as they drove past. She had her rifle ready, and Daryl could see the tension in her posture. They both knew that the quiet was not a sign of safety. It was a sign of something more dangerous. Something lurking in the shadows. As they turned onto a side street, Daryl's headlights illuminated the crumbling remains of a storefront. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. The smell of decay lingered in the air, a reminder that this town had been abandoned for a long time. "This place is dead," Lorna said, her voice low. "There's nothing here." Daryl didn't respond immediately. He had learned not to take things at face value. Just because a town looked empty didn't mean it was. There could be survivors hidden in the buildings, or worse, something waiting to pick them off one by one. "We'll check the buildings," Daryl said. "But stay close. And keep your eyes open. If anyone's here, we need to be ready." They parked the truck in an alley, out of sight from the main street. Daryl motioned for Lorna to follow as he climbed out of the vehicle, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Emma remained in the back with the kids, who were still asleep, oblivious to the danger outside. Daryl led the way to the first building, a two-story structure that looked like it had once been a restaurant. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. He pushed it open slowly, his eyes darting around the room as he stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. Tables and chairs were overturned, and broken glass littered the floor. It looked like the place had been ransacked long ago. There was no sign of movement, but Daryl wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. He motioned for Lorna to cover the back entrance, then moved through the building methodically, checking every corner, every room. It didn't take long for him to realize that the place was empty. No survivors, no infected. Just another abandoned building in a forgotten town. He turned to Lorna, who was standing by the back door, her eyes scanning the street outside. She didn't say anything, but her posture was tense. She had a bad feeling too. "We'll check the next place," Daryl said, his voice grim. "But something tells me we're not alone here. Would you like to continue with part 8? Daryl couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The town felt too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He could feel it in his bones, something was off, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could stay here. The walls seemed to close in around him, and every creak of the building sent a ripple of tension through his body. The street outside the restaurant they had checked was just as empty, but Daryl's instincts told him not to relax. They hadn't seen anyone, but that didn't mean they were alone. He motioned to Lorna, and they both moved silently back to the truck, where Emma and the kids were waiting. The truck's headlights were now the only source of light, casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was thick with the promise of something worse to come. Daryl climbed into the driver's seat, his fingers brushing over the keys, but before he could turn the ignition, he heard it, an unmistakable sound. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, distant, but they grew louder, closer. Someone was moving toward them. Daryl's heart raced as he immediately turned off the engine and signaled for Lorna to stay low. The children in the back seat stirred but remained quiet. Emma was looking at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay calm," Daryl whispered, locking eyes with her. "Do exactly what I say, and we'll get through this." Emma nodded, her hand clutching her seatbelt. Daryl and Lorna both grabbed their weapons and waited. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of the truck's lights. A figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the faint glow from the building. A man. But he wasn't alone. Another figure emerged from the shadows. And then another. The hair on the back of Daryl's neck stood up as he realized they were surrounded. A group of survivors, at least 5, maybe more, appeared out of nowhere, standing just out of the truck's light. Daryl couldn't see their faces clearly, but he could tell by their posture and the way they moved that they were wary, cautious. "Who's there?" Daryl called out, his voice steady but loud enough to be heard by the group. The man who had stepped into the light raised a hand, signaling the others to stay back. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. "But we need your truck. And everything else you've got." Daryl's grip tightened on the rifle. The man's words were calm, but the menace behind them was unmistakable. It was the same tone that every survivor had when they were desperate, when they were willing to do anything to survive. Daryl had heard it before, and it never ended well. Lorna didn't say a word, but Daryl could feel her tense beside him, her finger brushing the trigger of her rifle. He needed to handle this carefully. They didn't know how many people were out there. They didn't know if these strangers were infected or just looking to take whatever they could. "You don't want to do this," Daryl said, his voice low but firm. "There's nothing here for you. Just move on." The man laughed, but it wasn't a joyful sound, it was dark, cynical. "You think we haven't been down this road before? We've seen it all. We're taking what's ours. And you don't get to make that decision." Daryl glanced at Lorna, silently asking for her opinion. She gave a small nod, her eyes sharp, ready for anything. She was prepared for the worst. They both were. "I'll make you a deal," Daryl said, his voice a little louder now, more commanding. "You walk away, and we'll let you live. But you try anything, and we won't hesitate." The group of survivors hesitated for a moment, and Daryl could sense the shifting tension in the air. It was clear they were debating whether to push forward or retreat. Daryl's finger was resting on the trigger now, his heart pounding in his chest. The standoff seemed to last forever, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice more resigned than before. "Fine. Keep your truck. But this isn't over. There are more of us out here. We'll be back." The group slowly backed away, disappearing back into the shadows from where they had come. Daryl didn't let his guard down until they were well and truly gone, and even then, he didn't feel a sense of relief. He knew better than that. "What now?" Lorna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daryl didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the darkness, his mind working quickly. "We move. Now. We can't stay here." They quickly packed up the truck, and Daryl started the engine, his eyes constantly scanning the area as they drove off. The fear and uncertainty of the encounter still hung heavy in the air. He wasn't sure if they had made the right call by letting them go, but for now, it was the only choice they had. The truck sped down the empty road, the night swallowing them whole. Daryl knew that every decision from here on out would be critical. The world they were living in was cruel and unpredictable, and every choice they made could either keep them alive or lead them into a trap. He glanced at Lorna, who was staring out the window, her face unreadable. The kids were asleep again, their quiet breaths the only sound in the truck. And Emma, sitting in the back, still hadn't said a word. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, they had made it through the night. And that had to be enough. This concludes Dead America, When Peace Ended and the Real War for Survival Began. Would you like to explore another story or need assistance with something else?